They say every generation believes it had it harder than the next. That memory softens pain. That time erases struggle. But the truth is quieter than that. People who grew up before the internet and social media didn't grow up with less pressure. They grew up with invisible pressure. There were no timelines to compare lives, no notifications to validate feelings, no digital language for loneliness, anxiety, or emotional fatigue. Pain had fewer names then. Silence was often mistaken for strength. What happens to a mind that learns early to wait instead of refresh, to endure instead of express, to carry questions without answers arriving instantly? This generation learned patience before it learned permission, resilience before reassurance, independence before understanding, and beneath that calm surface lives a psychology shaped by absence, not of love, but of mirrors. This is not nostalgia, and this is not criticism. It is an exploration of how growing up offline quietly shaped the emotional architecture of millions, and how those patterns still echo today. Let's begin. Before the internet, before search bars and comment sections, silence was not empty. It was instructional. Children learned early that emotions were something to manage, not explain. If something hurt, you waited. If something confused you, you figured it out alone. If something overwhelmed you, you endured. Quietly. There were fewer words for inner experiences then. Anxiety was called nerves. Sadness was called being tired. Sensitivity was called overthinking. And so many learned to compress their inner worlds into something smaller, something acceptable. Not because no one cared, but because caring had limits, timeframes, and expectations. Crying was allowed, but briefly. Questions were welcomed, but not endlessly. Emotions were acknowledged, but rarely explored. This was not cruelty. It was culture. In homes without digital distraction, feelings didn't compete with screens, but they also didn't find mirrors. There was no instant reassurance saying, "Others feel this too." No quiet validation arriving at midnight through glowing text. So silence became a skill. A child learned to sit with discomfort the way one sits through long seasons, trusting that eventually something would change. They learned to listen more than speak, to observe before reacting. Psychologically, this created deep internal landscapes, strong inner dialogue, early self-reliance. But it also planted something quieter, a habit of emotional self-containment. When feelings stayed inside long enough, they became familiar, and familiar things are rarely questioned. Over time, silence stopped feeling like absence. It felt like maturity, like control, like strength. Yet beneath that calm exterior, emotions didn't disappear. They settled, layer by layer, like sediment at the bottom of a slow-moving river. And rivers that move quietly can still carry immense weight. Many from this generation still pause before speaking their truth, still minimize their needs instinctively, still believe that being low maintenance is a form of love, not because they lack emotion, but because they learned early that emotion was something you held, not something you handed over. This is where the story truly begins. Not with technology, but with what happens when a heart learns to be its own witness. Before profiles, before public opinion became quantifiable, identity formed slowly. There were no numbers attached to likability, no visible score for being enough. People who grew up before the internet learned who they were without watching others perform who they might be. There was less comparison, but also less confirmation. You did not see hundreds of lives unfolding beside yours. You saw a few: family, neighbors, maybe a handful of colleagues. So the mind built its sense of self from repetition, rather than reflection, from routine rather than reaction. Psychologically, this created a grounded identity, one that was not easily shaken by trends or opinions, one that relied on internal consistency rather than external applause. But there is another side to this quiet strength. Without mirrors, doubts had nowhere to land. Questions like "Am I normal?" or "Is this feeling shared?" remained unanswered, unchallenged, uncomforted. In a connected world, identity is shaped through feedback. In an offline world, identity was shaped through endurance. You learned who you were by surviving situations, not by being seen in them, by adapting, not by expressing. Psychologists call this self-referenced identity, a sense of self built inwardly, through private standards, rather than social reflection. It creates resilience. But it can also create isolation, because when self-worth is self-built, asking for reassurance can feel unnecessary, or even shameful. So many learn to trust themselves deeply, but also to doubt silently, to feel confident and uncertain at the same time. This is why compliments sometimes feel uncomfortable to this generation, why praise can feel undeserved, why recognition may be acknowledged politely, but never absorbed fully. The self was never meant to be evaluated publicly. It was meant to function, and so worth became tied to usefulness, to reliability, to being the one who doesn't need much. Yet even the strongest roots grow better when sunlight reaches them, and many who grew up without mirrors still wonder, quietly, what it would have felt like to be seen, not admired, but understood. This chapter is not about regret. It is about recognition, because understanding how identity was formed is the first gentle step toward allowing it to soften. Before answers arrived instantly, waiting was woven into everyday life. You waited for letters, for phone calls, for news, for people to come home. Waiting was not an interruption. It was the default state, and the mind adapted accordingly. Psychologically, this environment trained long attention spans and deep tolerance for uncertainty. There was time for thoughts to stretch, for emotions to unfold slowly, for boredom to exist without being immediately filled. Waiting strengthened impulse control. Delayed gratification became normal, not heroic. But waiting also shaped emotional expectations. If you were upset, you waited for it to pass. If you missed someone, you waited for the next meeting. If something felt unresolved, you carried it, sometimes for years. Neuroscience tells us that repeated delay trains the brain to suppress urgency, to quiet emotional alarms, to downregulate need. This created calm exteriors, composed reactions, a sense of steadiness others often admire. But emotional waiting has a cost. When the nervous system learns that relief is always later, it stops asking for it now. Needs become negotiable. Desires become optional. Many from this generation learned to wait even when something hurt. Even when something should have been addressed. They became experts at postponing themselves. In a fast world, this looks like patience. But internally, it can feel like distance from urgency, even from joy. Because joy, like pain, needs permission to arrive. And permission was rarely immediate. This is why some still struggle with modern speed. Not because it's overwhelming, but because it feels unfamiliar, untrustworthy. Instant connection can feel shallow. Instant reassurance can feel suspicious. The mind learned that meaningful things take time, and so it resists shortcuts, even when they are harmless. Waiting shaped a deep relationship with time, but it also taught the heart to stand still longer than it needed to. And now, in a world that moves faster than thought, many are discovering something surprising. They are not slow. They are simply used to depth. Strength once was measured by how little you revealed, by how reliably you showed up, by how well you carried weight without letting it spill. People who grew up before the internet learned that emotions were private matters, handled internally, displayed selectively. There was respect in composure, dignity in restraint. Psychologically, this created extraordinary emotional regulation. The ability to remain calm under pressure, to continue functioning even when something inside was fractured. But regulation slowly turned into suppression. When pain was not spoken, it did not disappear. It relocated into the body, into habits, into silence. This generation became skilled at living with discomfort, at adjusting expectations downward, at carrying unresolved feelings without protest. They learned that expressing distress could burden others. That vulnerability required justification. That strength meant being needed, not needing. So grief was shortened, anger was softened, loneliness was normalized. Psychologists describe this as Stoic adaptation, a coping style where emotional endurance becomes identity. It allows survival, but it often blocks relief. Over time, emotions held too long begin to harden. Like lava cooling into stone, still shaped by fire, but no longer warm. This is why some feel emotionally distant even in close relationships. Why conversations stay practical. Why deeper feelings surface only in rare, unguarded moments. It is not a lack of emotion. It is an excess of responsibility. Strength that never spoke became invisible, even to the person carrying it. Until one day, exhaustion appears without a clear cause, or numbness settles in quietly, and the question arises, not loudly, but gently. When did being strong stop feeling alive? This chapter is not an accusation. It is an acknowledgement, because survival was never the problem. The silence around it was, and what has been carried silently for decades is now asking, not to be fixed, but to be heard. At some point, the world changed faster than the inner rules could adapt. The same mind that learned patience was suddenly asked for immediacy. The same heart trained for privacy was exposed to constant visibility, and a quiet conflict began. People who grew up before the internet often feel split between two tempos. Internally, they move slowly, carefully, deliberately. Externally, everything rushes. Messages expect replies. Silence is misread. Presence is measured by activity, not depth. Psychologically, this creates temporal dissonance, a mismatch between internal pacing and external demand. It does not create chaos. It creates fatigue, because adapting requires translation. Every interaction becomes an adjustment. Every expression feels slightly out of time. The old coping strategy, endure, wait, stay composed, no longer fits a world that rewards visibility. But it is too deeply ingrained to abandon easily. So many live in between, not fully offline, not fully at ease online. They post rarely, but carefully. They speak thoughtfully, but hesitate. They feel deeply but disclose selectively. This conflict can look like resistance to change, but internally, it feels like loyalty to a self shaped long before algorithms learned how to amplify emotion. There is also grief here, not loud grief. Quiet grief. Grief for slower conversations. For attention that stayed. For meaning that was not measured in reactions. And beneath that grief is confusion. Why does connection feel easier and harder at the same time? Why does being reachable feel like being exposed? The nervous system that once thrived on predictability now navigates constant stimulation. It learns to stay alert, even when nothing is wrong. This is why rest can feel uneasy. Why scrolling feels numbing instead of soothing. Why presence sometimes feels performative. The conflict is not about technology. It is about identity under pressure. When old strengths are misunderstood in a new world, the self begins to question itself, and that questioning, more than change itself, is where tension quietly lives. Realization does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself with certainty. It comes in pauses, in moments of emotional fatigue that feel unfamiliar, in questions that surface without urgency. At some point, many begin to notice a pattern, not failure, not weakness. A pattern. They notice how quickly they minimize their own needs, how instinctively they say it's fine, how rarely they ask for space, reassurance, or rest. And for the first time, that behavior is not judged. It is contextualized. Psychology tells us that the mind protects itself using what once worked. Adaptations become identities when they are never revisited. The strength learned in silence was necessary. The patience learned through waiting was protective. The restraint learned through responsibility was stabilizing. But what protected then may restrict now. This realization can feel destabilizing, not because something is wrong, but because something long unquestioned is finally seen. There is grief in this awareness. Grief for moments when expression was swallowed, for feelings that went unnamed. But there is also relief, because understanding removes blame. It reframes self-criticism into compassion. The question shifts from why am I like this, to what happened that taught me to be this way. This is the beginning of softness. Not change, not correction, just recognition. and recognition loosens what has been held tightly for decades. The nervous system begins to learn that strength does not require constant vigilance, that composure does not require self-erasure. Nothing needs to be undone, nothing needs to be rewritten, only understood. This chapter is the quiet hinge of the story, where survival stops being the only measure of success. And for the first time, something opens. Not outwardly, inwardly. Softening is often misunderstood. It sounds like weakening, like letting something go that once kept you safe. But psychologically, integration is not subtraction, it is expansion. People who grew up before the internet do not need to abandon their resilience. They only need to stop guarding it so tightly. Integration begins quietly, with permission, not instruction. Permission to feel without explaining, to rest without earning it, to speak without rehearsing. The nervous system, once trained to stay composed, begins to learn a new rhythm, one that includes pauses, one that allows emotional response without immediate containment. This does not happen suddenly. It unfolds slowly, like erosion reshaping stone over time. Moments of softness appear unexpectedly, in conversations that linger, in emotions that surface without being pushed back down. There is often discomfort here, not because softness is dangerous, but because it is unfamiliar. For decades, endurance meant safety. Now presence begins to feel just as stabilizing. Psychology recognizes this as emotional integration, the ability to hold strength and vulnerability without conflict. It is not expressive, it is honest. This generation often integrates in subtle ways, by listening more deeply, by choosing fewer words, but truer ones, by allowing silence to include feeling, not just restraint. They do not overshare, they do not dramatize, they soften internally first, and slowly the body responds. Tension releases without explanation, fatigue eases without a clear reason, because what was held no longer needs to be held alone. Integration does not change the past, it changes how the past lives in the present, and in that quiet shift, something profound happens. Strength begins to feel lighter, not less real, just less heavy. What remains after decades is not the silence, it is the depth it created. People who grew up before the internet carry something rare, an ability to be alone without disappearing, to listen without waiting to respond, to feel without needing an audience. Their emotions learn to move inward like underground rivers, unseen, but steady. They learned how to sit with themselves, how to survive unanswered questions, how to build meaning without constant affirmation. This is not a lost art, it is a quiet one. In a world that speaks constantly, this generation still knows the language of pauses, still understands that not everything needs to be shared to be real. But what remains is not only wisdom, it is tenderness. A tenderness shaped by responsibility, by early independence, by learning to grow up without maps for the inner world. And perhaps that is why empathy often runs deep here, why listening feels natural, why presence feels sincere. This story was never about being better or worse than other generations. It was about context, about how a different emotional climate shaped different inner weather. If there is something to carry forward, it is not the silence, but the strength behind it. Strength that can now coexist with expression. Patience that can now coexist with need. Nothing is missing. Nothing was wasted. Only waiting, quietly, to be seen. If this video made you feel seen in a way you didn't expect, if parts of this reflection felt familiar, even quietly emotional, if something inside you softened as you listened, know this: you were never alone in the way you learned to carry yourself. Many grew the same way, in silence, in patience, in strength that never asked to be noticed. This space exists for those inner worlds, a place where psychology meets gentleness, where unspoken experiences are allowed to breathe. If you'd like to stay connected, you're welcome to join this channel, not as a subscriber, but as a fellow human exploring the hidden corners of the mind and heart. And if you ever feel like sharing, the comments are open. only if you want to. Your words might help someone else feel less alone in their own quiet story.